Behind the gilded thrones and careful diplomacy of Britain's monarchy lived rulers whose tempers could shake kingdoms. Tonight, we explore 20 royals whose struggles with anger shaped history in ways the public rarely witnessed, from violent outbursts that cost lives to explosive rages behind palace doors. These stories reveal the human cost of unchecked fury at the highest levels of power. Before we explore these moments of royal rage, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, not just for more untold stories, but because understanding these struggles reminds us that even power cannot always control emotion. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now let's begin. Number 1. King Henry VIII, the tyrant king's terrible temper. King Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547, demonstrated patterns of rage that grew increasingly dangerous as his reign progressed. Born in 1491 as the second son of Henry VII, he inherited the throne unexpectedly after his older brother's death. Contemporary accounts from his early reign describe a charismatic young king, but the Henry of later years became a figure whose anger could cost advisors and wives their lives. Historical records document how Henry's temper transformed from youthful impatience into something far more threatening. Court observers noted that as he aged, particularly after a jousting accident in 1536 left him with chronic pain, his capacity for rage intensified dramatically. Multiple sources describe a king whose moods shifted unpredictably, leaving courtiers uncertain whether they would face charm or fury on any given day. The executions that marked Henry's reign often stemmed from moments of anger rather than careful deliberation. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Anne Boleyn all fell victim to a king whose rage, once triggered, led swiftly to accusations of treason and death. Biographers examining court records suggest that Henry's anger frequently operated on suspicion rather than evidence, with the king's emotional state determining the fate of those around him. His treatment of his wives revealed similar patterns. Contemporary accounts describe violent outbursts directed at Catherine of Aragon when she failed to produce a male heir, and sources recorded his explosive fury toward Anne Boleyn before her execution. The speed with which Henry could turn from affection to deadly anger shocked observers who witnessed these transformations. Henry's final years saw his temper become even more volatile. His massive weight, chronic pain, and declining health created a king who was frequently uncomfortable and increasingly quick to rage. Palace staff learned to recognize signs of approaching fury and would warn each other when the king appeared agitated. His Privy Council members approached him with visible anxiety, aware that disagreement could trigger explosions with potentially fatal consequences. He died in January 1547 at age 55, leaving behind a legacy where his achievements remain intertwined with the violence his temper inflicted on those closest to him. Number 2. King Henry II, the Plantagenet Fury. King Henry II, who ruled England from 1154 to 1189, possessed a temper so legendary that chroniclers of his era recorded it with a mixture of fear and fascination. Born in 1133, Henry built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but contemporary sources suggest his greatest battles were often with his own rage, which could erupt without warning and terrify everyone in his presence. Medieval chroniclers described Henry's fury in vivid detail. When angered, historical accounts report that he would throw himself on the floor, tear at his clothes, and even chew the rushes that covered palace floors. These weren't theatrical displays. Multiple independent sources describe genuine loss of control that left observers shocked by the intensity of his reactions. Courtiers learned to recognize warning signs and would quietly withdraw when they sensed his temper rising. The most infamous result of Henry's rage was the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. Historical records indicate that during an argument about Becket's defiance, Henry shouted words that his knights interpreted as a command to kill the archbishop. Sources agree that Henry's explosive anger in that moment led directly to 4 knights travelling to Canterbury Cathedral and murdering Becket at the altar. Whether Henry intended this outcome, or whether his rage spiraled beyond his control, the consequences haunted him for the remainder of his reign. His relationships with family members suffered equally from his volcanic temper. Contemporary sources document violent arguments with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, which contributed to their eventual estrangement and her long imprisonment. His sons, who eventually rebelled against him, had grown up witnessing their father's rages and experiencing his harsh treatment. Court officials developed strategies for managing the king's temper. Some would deliberately bring good news when they sensed Henry's mood darkening, while others learned to present difficult information carefully. These tactics worked inconsistently, as Henry's rage could be sparked by matters both significant and trivial. He died in 1189 at age 56, reportedly broken by his son's final rebellion. Henry's legacy includes impressive achievements, but contemporary chronicles emphasize equally his fearsome temper and the damage it inflicted throughout his 35-year reign. Number 3. King John, the cruel king's violent rages. King John, who ruled England from 1199 to 1216, earned the nickname Bad King John, partly through his notoriously cruel temper and violent behaviour toward those who displeased him. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II, John inherited both his father's throne and apparently his volcanic temperament, though contemporary chroniclers suggest John's anger manifested with additional cruelty that even his harsh era found disturbing. Medieval records document incidents of shocking treatment stemming from John's rages. Multiple chroniclers describe how prisoners died under harsh conditions when he was angered by their defiance, and sources close to the court recorded instances where John was present during the punishment of those who had earned his fury. These weren't isolated incidents, but patterns of behaviour that terrified his subjects and alienated the nobility whose support he needed to govern effectively. His treatment of hostages revealed particularly disturbing aspects of his temper. Historical accounts describe how John, enraged by resistance from Welsh princes, made decisions regarding their sons who were being held as hostages at his court that contemporary sources considered extremely harsh. Medieval nobles, who understood hostage-taking as standard practice, were reportedly shocked by actions taken during John's moments of rage, viewing them as crossing boundaries that tradition usually respected. The loss of Normandy to France in 1204 intensified John's already difficult temperament. Chroniclers noted that the king became increasingly suspicious and prone to explosive anger, perceiving disloyalty in many quarters and responding to perceived betrayals with immediate fury. His barons grew increasingly unwilling to serve a king whose temper made any interaction potentially dangerous, contributing to the widespread opposition that eventually forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Court observers described physical manifestations of John's rage that resembled his father's famous tantrums. Sources report that he would pace violently and shout for extended periods, with some accounts mentioning that he was known to strike out in anger at those unfortunate enough to be nearby when his temper erupted. Unlike his father, whose rages were often followed by remorse, contemporary accounts suggest John showed little regret for actions taken in fury. He died in 1216 at age 49, during a civil war, partly caused by the alienation his temper and harsh rule had created among his nobility. Number 4. King George III, periods of volatile behaviour. King George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1820, experienced episodes throughout his reign that contemporary observers described as periods of severe emotional volatility. Born in 1738, George began his reign as a capable and conscientious monarch, but historical accounts document recurring instances when his behaviour changed dramatically, creating situations that alarmed his family, ministers, and court attendants who witnessed these transformations. Medical historians examining contemporary records note that George experienced multiple episodes where his emotional state became extremely unstable. During these periods, sources describe someone whose reactions to minor provocations became disproportionately intense, whose speech patterns changed notably, and whose ability to maintain the composure expected of a monarch appeared to deteriorate significantly. Court officials documented their concerns in letters and diaries, describing a king who seemed fundamentally altered during these episodes. The political consequences of George's volatile periods were substantial. His ministers struggled to manage governmental affairs when the king's emotional state made consistent decision-making difficult. Historical records show that during certain periods, advisors would delay presenting matters requiring royal attention, hoping to wait for times when George appeared more stable. This created governmental complications as urgent business accumulated while officials hesitated to approach a monarch whose reactions had become unpredictable. His family relationships suffered particularly during these episodes. Contemporary accounts describe Queen Charlotte's distress at witnessing her husband's altered state, and sources suggest his children developed anxiety about their father's condition that affected their relationships with him even during his more stable periods. The contrast between George's usual careful demeanour and his behaviour during volatile episodes was stark enough that those who witnessed both states found the transformation deeply disturbing. The regency crisis that eventually resulted in his son taking over governmental responsibilities reflected the severity and frequency of these episodes. By 1811, George's periods of instability had become too frequent and prolonged for him to continue governing effectively. He lived another 9 years in seclusion at Windsor Castle, where his volatile behaviour continued to distress the reduced household staff who cared for him. He died in 1820 at age 81, having spent his final decade largely separated from the governmental and family life he had once managed. Modern medical historians have proposed various explanations for George's condition, though definitive diagnosis remains impossible given historical distance and limited medical documentation from the era. Number 5. Queen Mary I, religious zeal and royal fury. Queen Mary I, who ruled England from 1553 to 1558, approached her reign with an intensity that contemporary observers found remarkable, even in an era of religious conflict. Born in 1516 as the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary spent years watching her mother be cast aside and her own legitimacy questioned. Historical sources suggest these experiences shaped an emotional intensity that manifested powerfully once she finally claimed the throne. Mary's determination to restore Catholic worship to England was pursued with a fervour that sources describe as consuming much of her attention and energy. Contemporary accounts indicate she viewed Protestant resistance not merely as political opposition, but as personal affronts that triggered strong emotional reactions. Biographers examining her correspondence note language, suggesting she took religious disagreement as attacks on both her faith and her authority, responding with intensity that alarmed even some of her Catholic supporters. Mary's policies led to the execution of many Protestants during her 5-year reign, a pace of religious prosecution that shocked contemporaries and created the dark legacy that has defined her historical reputation. While religious prosecution was not unusual in this era, sources suggest the scale reflected Mary's personal conviction and deep commitment to restoring Catholic practice. These decisions, made during a period of intense religious and political conflict, became the defining aspect of her reign and earned her the historical nickname Bloody Mary. Her relationship with her husband, Philip of Spain, revealed other aspects of her emotional intensity. Contemporary observers described Mary's attachment to Philip as notably strong, and sources suggest she experienced considerable distress during his frequent absences. Court accounts indicate her moods were significantly affected by Philip's presence or absence, with advisers noting that she was more accessible and easier to work with when he was in England. Mary's final years were marked by declining health and what sources describe as increasing emotional difficulty. Her phantom pregnancy, which she desperately believed was real despite all evidence otherwise, reflected the intensity of her desire for an heir. The realization that she would die childless, leaving the throne to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, reportedly caused her profound distress. She died in November 1558 at age 42, having achieved her goal of restoring Catholic worship, but leaving a legacy defined primarily by the religious prosecutions her policies had driven. Number 6. King Richard I, the Lionheart's battlefield rage. King Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart, ruled England from 1189 to 1199, and earned his reputation primarily through military prowess rather than governing ability. Born in 1157, Richard spent most of his reign away from England, fighting in the Third Crusade and various continental conflicts. Contemporary chronicles describe a warrior whose fury in battle became legendary, though sources suggest this same intensity created difficulties in other aspects of his kingship. Medieval accounts of Richard's military campaigns emphasize the ferocity he displayed in combat. Chroniclers describe a commander who led from the front, whose aggression in battle inspired his troops while terrifying opponents. Sources from both Christian and Muslim chroniclers noted Richard's reputation for battlefield fury, describing someone whose intensity in combat went beyond typical military leadership into territory that contemporary observers found remarkable even in an era that valued martial prowess. His treatment of prisoners after the Siege of Acre in 1191 demonstrated how his battlefield temperament could lead to controversial decisions. Historical records indicate that when negotiations over ransom and prisoner exchange stalled, Richard made decisions regarding thousands of Muslim prisoners that contemporary sources described as shocking observers on both sides of the conflict. These actions reflected frustration at negotiation delays rather than careful strategic calculation. Richard's relationships with family members were marked by similar intensity. His conflicts with his father Henry II involved actual warfare, with Richard taking up arms against his own father. Contemporary accounts suggest personal anger drove these rebellions as much as political calculation. His relationship with his brother John was equally contentious, marked by mutual suspicion that only intensified during Richard's frequent absences from England. His imprisonment in Austria following his return from crusade resulted partly from the enemies his temperament had created. The Duke of Austria, whom Richard had apparently offended during the Siege of Acre, seized the opportunity when Richard passed through his territory. The substantial ransom required for Richard's release strained England's finances significantly. He died in 1199 at age 41 from an infected arrow wound received while besieging a minor castle in France, reportedly over a dispute about treasure. His death from such a relatively trivial conflict reflected how his aggressive temperament continued driving him toward combat, even when strategic value was minimal. Number 7. Queen Victoria, the grandmother's hidden temper. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, cultivated a public image of dignified propriety that concealed a temper her family and household staff knew intimately. Born in 1819, Victoria ruled for over 60 years, and throughout that long reign, those closest to her experienced regular outbursts that contrasted sharply with her carefully maintained public persona. Multiple biographers examining private correspondence describe someone whose anger, while kept from public view, significantly affected those who lived and worked with her. Historical accounts from Victoria's household reveal patterns of explosive temper directed at servants and family members. Sources describe incidents where Victoria threw objects when displeased, with items ranging from books to jewellery being hurled at those who had earned her anger. Her ladies-in-waiting left detailed accounts of these episodes, describing how the Queen's fury could erupt over matters both significant and trivial, leaving staff members uncertain what might trigger the next explosion. Her children bore the brunt of Victoria's temper throughout their lives. Contemporary sources document that she would express her disappointment in ways that caused lasting emotional impact. Her eldest son, who became Edward VII, remained somewhat wary of his mother well into middle age, and her daughters described in private letters the anxiety they felt about incurring her displeasure. Victoria's temper created an atmosphere where family members approached her with visible apprehension. Her treatment of her beloved husband Albert revealed that even her closest relationship wasn't exempt from her fury. Private correspondence indicates that Victoria could direct significant anger at Albert over disagreements, though these episodes were typically followed by remorse and apologies. After Albert's death in 1861, sources suggest her temper intensified, with grief apparently worsening emotional volatility she had always possessed. Court officials and government ministers developed strategies for managing Victoria's temperament. They learned optimal times to present difficult news and would coordinate about who should approach her with various matters, selecting messengers they believed might minimize explosive reactions. These careful calculations reflected widespread understanding that Victoria's anger, while rarely seen publicly, was a significant factor that those working with her had to navigate constantly throughout her extraordinarily long reign. Number 8. King George V, the intimidating father. King George V, who ruled from 1910 to 1936, maintained a household atmosphere that his children later described with considerable apprehension. Born in 1865 as the second son of Edward VII, George had pursued a naval career and brought military discipline to his approach to both kingship and family life. Multiple biographers examining family correspondence describe a father whose temper and harsh standards created lasting effects on his children's relationships with him throughout their lives. Historical accounts document George's approach to parenting as notably strict, even by the standards of his era. His children were expected to maintain rigid standards of behavior and punctuality, with deviations resulting in expressions of anger that sources describe as intimidating. Court observers noted that George's sons would visibly tense when summoned to their father's presence, uncertain whether they would face approval or harsh criticism for perceived failures to meet his exacting expectations. His relationship with his eldest son, who became Edward VIII, was particularly strained by George's temperament. Contemporary sources indicate that George frequently expressed disappointment in David's behavior, delivering criticism in ways that humiliated rather than guided. Private letters reveal that even as an adult, David remained somewhat wary of his father's reactions, and biographers suggest this difficult relationship contributed to insecurities that later affected Edward's brief reign. George's second son, who became George VI, suffered from his father's harsh approach. Historical accounts describe a boy with a stutter who found his father's impatience with this speech difficulty deeply distressing. Rather than offering support, sources suggest George's visible frustration at his son's stammering worsened the condition. The lasting impact of this treatment affected Bertie throughout his life, contributing to anxiety that made public speaking particularly challenging during his unexpected kingship. His daughter Mary later described growing up in an atmosphere of constant concern about incurring their father's displeasure. Court staff members noted that the household would become noticeably tense when George was in residence, with servants and family alike moving carefully to avoid triggering his temper. While George took his duties seriously, his inability to moderate his harsh temperament created emotional distance that his children felt throughout their lives and remembered long after his death in 1936. Number 9. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The sharp-tongued prince. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who served as consort to Queen Elizabeth II from 1952 until his death in 2021, became known for a directness of speech that frequently caused discomfort and occasionally created diplomatic incidents. Born in 1921 into Greek and Danish royalty, Philip spent decades in the public eye, and his approach to conversation reflected a personality that valued bluntness over diplomatic courtesy. Multiple biographers have documented instances where his sharp remarks created awkward situations for those around him. Public records contain numerous examples of Philip's notably direct comments during official engagements. News reports from throughout his decades of public service documented remarks that recipients sometimes found surprising or uncomfortable. These weren't isolated incidents, but represented a consistent pattern of speech that those who worked with Philip learned to anticipate. Palace staff reportedly developed strategies for minimizing situations where Philip's unfiltered comments might create diplomatic complications. His interactions with the press were particularly marked by this directness. Contemporary accounts describe someone who made little effort to maintain the carefully neutral tone that royal protocols typically required. Journalists covering royal events learned that Philip might respond to questions with sharp retorts rather than practice diplomatic answers. While some found this refreshing honesty, others noted that his comments occasionally crossed lines that more careful consideration might have respected. Within family contexts, sources suggest Philip's directness could be experienced as harshness. His children have spoken publicly about their father's demanding standards and his tendency to express criticism more readily than praise. While his approach reflected his own upbringing and naval background, where direct communication was valued, biographers note that this quality sometimes created strain in relationships where more gentleness might have been beneficial. His approach to royal duties demonstrated similar patterns. Philip expected efficiency and competence, and sources indicate he had limited patience for what he viewed as unnecessary formality or incompetence. Staff members describe someone who could be supportive, but who also expressed frustration directly when things didn't meet his standards. This consistency of temperament, maintained throughout his nearly 7 decades of public service, became one of his defining characteristics, creating a public persona that was distinctly less diplomatic than traditional royal behavior typically allowed. Number 10. King Edward VII, gambling fury and social rage. King Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1910, after spending nearly 60 years as heir to the throne, possessed a temperament that those close to him learned to navigate carefully. Born in 1841 as Queen Victoria's eldest son, Edward developed a personality marked by intense reactions to situations that displeased him, particularly regarding gambling losses and perceived social slights. Contemporary accounts from courtiers describe someone whose anger could erupt suddenly and whose displeasure created uncomfortable situations for everyone present. Historical records document Edward's relationship with gambling as emotionally charged in ways that went beyond mere recreation. Sources describe incidents where substantial losses at card tables or racetracks would trigger visible frustration that alarmed those playing with him. Contemporary observers noted that Edward's mood during gambling sessions could shift dramatically based on wins or losses, with losing streaks resulting in outbursts directed at dealers, fellow players, or circumstances in general. Friends learned to recognize signs of mounting displeasure and would sometimes attempt to redirect him before his anger fully manifested. His treatment of servants and staff reflected similar patterns of explosive temper. Multiple sources from palace staff describe someone whose displeasure could be expressed with considerable force. If meals weren't prepared exactly to his specifications, or if any aspect of his comfort was compromised, Edward's response could be swift and harsh. Staff members developed elaborate systems for ensuring everything met his exacting standards, motivated largely by desire to avoid triggering his anger. Edward's social circles experienced his temper when they violated his sense of propriety or failed to show what he considered appropriate deference. Contemporary accounts describe incidents where perceived slights at social gatherings would result in Edward expressing his displeasure in ways that created lasting awkwardness. His expectations for how he should be treated were exacting, and failure to meet these could result in social consequences that those in his circles worked carefully to avoid. His numerous romantic relationships throughout his marriage were apparently not exempt from his temperamental nature. Sources suggest that even his companions experienced his anger when they displeased him, creating situations where managing his moods became necessary to maintain these relationships and avoid triggering explosions of temper that could end associations or create uncomfortable situations. Number 11. Princess Margaret, tantrums and social cruelty. Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, lived from 1930 to 2002 and became known among palace staff and social circles for a temperament that could shift from charming to cutting with remarkable speed. Born into the royal family, but forever in her sister's shadow, Margaret developed a personality that biographers describe as demanding and sometimes harsh, particularly toward those who served her or who she felt had slighted her. Historical accounts from palace staff paint a picture of someone whose treatment of servants was notably difficult. Multiple former employees have described incidents where Margaret would respond to minor issues with expressions that went beyond correction into deliberate humiliation. Sources indicate she expected immediate compliance with her wishes and would respond to any perceived inadequacy with anger that created tension among household staff. Unlike some royals who maintained polite distance from servants, Margaret appeared to take particular notice of them, specifically to criticize. Her behaviour in social settings revealed similar patterns. Contemporary accounts from friends describe someone who could be delightful company, but who might suddenly turn harsh if she felt slighted. She was known for cutting remarks delivered with precision designed to wound, and sources suggest she took satisfaction in her ability to deliver verbal attacks that left recipients unsure how to respond. This wasn't directed only at perceived enemies, but could be aimed at friends and family members who happened to displease her in the moment. Margaret's reactions to disappointments were witnessed by numerous people throughout her adult life. Sources describe incidents where she would respond to frustrations with outbursts that seemed disproportionate to the triggering events. These weren't private expressions, but public displays that created uncomfortable situations for everyone present. Her inability or unwillingness to moderate these reactions, even in formal social settings, suggested patterns of behaviour that went beyond occasional bad moods. Her later years, marked by declining health and increasing isolation, apparently did little to soften her temperament. Sources close to her final decade describe someone whose capacity for anger remained intact, even as her physical capabilities diminished, creating challenges for those tasked with her care, and demonstrating that her difficult temperament was a lifelong characteristic, rather than a phase of youth. Number 12. King George IV, drunken rages and royal excess. King George IV, who ruled from 1820 to 1830 after serving as Prince Regent from 1811, possessed a temperament that became increasingly volatile as his consumption of alcohol intensified throughout his life. Born in 1762 as the eldest son of King George III, he began his adult years as a charming, if self-indulgent prince. But contemporary accounts document how his personality grew more difficult as decades of excessive drinking took their toll on his emotional stability. Historical records from courtiers describe someone whose moods became notably unpredictable when he had been drinking, which sources suggest occurred with increasing frequency as he aged. Contemporary observers noted that George's reactions to minor frustrations would escalate into explosive anger when alcohol was involved, with outbursts that alarmed those present. His temper during these episodes could be directed at anyone nearby, from high-ranking nobles to palace servants, with little regard for rank or appropriateness. His treatment of his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, revealed particularly harsh aspects of his temperament. Historical accounts describe verbal attacks delivered with cruelty, designed to wound, particularly when George had been drinking. Their marriage was notoriously unhappy, and sources suggest George's anger toward Caroline went beyond personal animosity, into territory that contemporaries found excessive. His attempts to prevent her from attending his coronation reflected anger that persisted years after their estrangement. George's relationships with his brothers and father were marked by similar volatility. Contemporary accounts document explosive arguments with his father during George III's periods of better health, with the prince's temper apparently inherited from the king, but expressed with less restraint. His treatment of his brothers varied based on his mood, with sources describing sudden shifts from affection to hostility that left his siblings uncertain of their standing. His final years saw his temperament worsen alongside declining physical health. Sources describe a king whose anger became more frequent, possibly reflecting the combined effects of decades of excessive consumption on his state. Palace staff developed protocols for managing situations when the king's temper flared, attempting to minimize the impact of his outbursts on governmental functions. He died in 1830 at age 67, leaving behind memories of a reign marked as much by his difficult personality as by the political events of his time. Number 13. King Henry I, the Lion of Justice's dark side. King Henry I, who ruled England from 1100 to 1135, earned the nickname Lion of Justice for his legal reforms. But contemporary chronicles also document a capacity for anger that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to harsh royal justice. Born in 1068 as the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry seized the English throne through political maneuvering, and sources suggest he maintained power partly through willingness to respond to challenges with swift and sometimes harsh force. Medieval records document incidents where Henry's anger led to punishments that contemporaries described as extreme. One particularly notorious example involved his response to a military defeat caused partly by errors in judgment. Historical accounts describe how Henry, enraged by what he viewed as betrayal and incompetence, ordered severe punishment for those he held responsible. This wasn't spontaneous violence, but calculated action, decided in anger and carried out deliberately, creating consequences that sources suggest affected family relationships permanently. His treatment of those who challenged his authority revealed similar patterns of rage translated into harsh action. Contemporary chroniclers describe swift and severe responses to rebellion or perceived disloyalty, with Henry's anger manifesting in punishments that went beyond what military necessity required. Sources suggest that Henry's temper, once triggered by opposition, led to measures designed not just to neutralize threats, but to express his fury at being challenged. Henry's personal relationships were affected by his temperament. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland was reportedly strained by his difficult personality, and sources indicate that courtiers learned to approach the king carefully, timing their requests and reports to avoid triggering his anger. The elaborate court culture that developed during his reign included unwritten rules about managing Henry's moods and avoiding situations that might provoke his fury. His death in 1135, reportedly from food poisoning after eating lampreys against his physician's advice, ended a reign that had brought administrative improvements, but also demonstrated how royal anger could manifest in actions that created lasting impact. Medieval chroniclers, while praising Henry's legal reforms, also recorded his capacity for rage-driven severity as a defining aspect of his personality and reign. Number 14. King Edward II, volatile moods and favoritism fury. King Edward II, who ruled England from 1307 to 1327, demonstrated emotional volatility that contributed significantly to the political disasters of his reign. Born in 1284 as the fourth son of Edward I, he inherited the throne unexpectedly. Contemporary chronicles describe someone whose moods shifted unpredictably and whose anger, particularly when his favourites were criticised, could lead to decisions that alienated the nobility and undermined his authority. Historical accounts emphasise Edward's intense emotional attachments to certain individuals, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Sources suggest that criticism of these favourites would trigger explosive reactions from Edward that went beyond reasonable defence. When barons attempted to limit Gaveston's influence, Edward's anger led to confrontations that escalated into armed conflict. His inability to moderate his reactions or compromise created political crises that more emotionally stable leadership might have avoided. His treatment of those who opposed his favourites revealed vindictive anger that chroniclers noted with concern. After Gaveston's murder by rebellious barons in 1312, Edward's fury drove him to seek revenge with an intensity that contemporary sources describe as consuming. When he finally defeated the barons responsible, his punishments were harsh enough that even medieval observers found them excessive. This pattern repeated with Hugh Despenser, where Edward's anger at threats to his favourite led to decisions that further alienated his nobility. Edward's relationship with his wife, Isabella of France, deteriorated partly due to his temperamental nature and his prioritization of his favourites over his marriage. Contemporary accounts suggest Isabella experienced the sharp edge of Edward's temper when she questioned his choices. Her eventual rebellion against him, leading to his forced abdication and imprisonment, reflected years of accumulated resentment at treatment sources described as harsh and dismissive. His final months in captivity at Berkeley Castle ended with his murder in September 1327. Edward's reign stands as a historical example of how emotional volatility and inability to control anger can undermine leadership, with his temperamental reactions to opposition contributing directly to the political chaos that eventually cost him his throne and life. Number 15. King Edward I, the Hammer's fierce temperament. King Edward I, who ruled England from 1272 to 1307, earned the nickname Hammer of the Scots through military campaigns that demonstrated both strategic skill and a temperament that contemporary chroniclers described as fearsome. Born in 1239, Edward grew into a king whose anger, when triggered, could have significant consequences for individuals and entire regions that opposed his authority. Military chronicles document Edward's reputation for fierce responses to resistance. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland were marked by actions that sources suggest reflected not just military necessity, but personal fury at opposition to his rule. When Welsh princes resisted his authority, Edward's response involved systematic suppression in ways that went beyond strategic requirements. Contemporary accounts suggest his anger at being defied drove decisions about how thoroughly to crush resistance. His treatment of the Scots after their rebellions revealed similar patterns. Historical records describe Edward's order to execute William Wallace with extreme severity in a display designed to terrify other potential rebels. While such punishments weren't unprecedented in medieval times, sources suggest the intensity of Edward's response reflected personal rage at Wallace's defiance. His demand that the Stone of Scone be removed from Scotland and brought to Westminster similarly demonstrated anger, translated into symbolic humiliation. Edward's relationships with his own nobility were marked by his difficult temperament. Court records indicate that nobles approached the king with caution, aware that his anger could be triggered by perceived disloyalty or incompetence. His conflicts with clergy, particularly his attempts to tax church property, escalated partly because Edward's temper made compromise difficult when he felt his authority was being questioned. His family life was not exempt from his harsh personality. Contemporary sources suggest Edward could be a demanding father whose expectations were exacting. His son, later Edward II, grew up under a father whose temperament created an atmosphere where fear of disappointing the king was a constant presence. Edward I died in 1307 at age 68, while leading another military campaign against Scotland, his fierce temperament driving him to remain in the field despite failing health and advanced age. Number 16. King William IV, naval temper and gruff outbursts. King William IV, who ruled from 1830 to 1837, brought to the throne a personality shaped by decades of naval service that had instilled in him both a direct communication style and a temper that palace officials found challenging. Born in 1765 as the third son of King George III, William never expected to become king and had spent his formative years in the Navy, where he developed habits more suited to a ship's quarterdeck than a royal court. Contemporary accounts from courtiers describe someone whose temper could flare quickly and whose expressions of anger reflected his naval background rather than royal refinement. William was known for using strong language when displeased, shocking those accustomed to more genteel royal behaviour. His outbursts, while not typically harmful, created uncomfortable situations in formal settings, where such directness was considered inappropriate. His relationship with politicians and government officials was marked by this gruff temperament. Historical records document instances where William's anger at political decisions led to expressions that went beyond constitutional boundaries. During conflicts over the Reform Bill, sources suggest William's temper nearly caused constitutional difficulties, as his anger at being pressured led him to threaten actions that more careful consideration might have prevented. His naval habit of expecting immediate obedience translated poorly to constitutional monarchy, where persuasion and compromise were necessary. William's treatment of his wife, Queen Adelaide, was reportedly more gentle than his public temperament might suggest, though sources indicate even she sometimes experienced his irritability. Court observers noted that Adelaide had developed strategies for managing William's moods, recognizing warning signs and knowing when to engage him and when to allow space for his temper to cool. His court was notably less formal than his predecessors, partly reflecting William's personality and partly his lack of patience for elaborate ceremony. While this informality made some aspects of royal life more relaxed, it also meant that William's temper was more visible than it might have been in a more structured environment. He died in 1837 at age 71, having reigned just 7 years, but leaving clear impressions on those who experienced his notably direct and sometimes explosive personality. Number 17. King Charles I, stubborn fury toward Parliament. King Charles I, who ruled from 1625 until his execution in 1649, demonstrated a temperament that contributed significantly to the political conflicts that eventually cost him his throne and his life. Born in 1600, Charles inherited both the crown and his father's belief in divine right of kings, but his rigid personality and angry responses to parliamentary opposition created confrontations that more flexible leadership might have navigated differently. Historical records document Charles's fury at what he viewed as parliamentary encroachment on royal authority. When Parliament attempted to limit his powers or questioned his decisions, contemporary sources describe a king whose anger manifested in stubborn refusal to compromise. His dissolution of Parliament multiple times reflected not just political strategy, but personal rage at being challenged by those he believed had no right to question his judgment. This pattern of angry confrontation rather than negotiation escalated tensions that eventually exploded into civil war. His treatment of parliamentary leaders who opposed him revealed vindictive aspects of his temperament. After attempting to arrest 5 members of Parliament in 1642, an action driven partly by anger at their criticism of his policies, Charles created a constitutional crisis that sources suggest reflected his inability to control his fury at opposition. His demand for absolute obedience, rooted in his belief in divine right, meant that disagreement was interpreted not as legitimate political difference, but as personal betrayal that triggered his temper. Charles's relationships with his advisors were marked by his difficult personality. Contemporary accounts suggest that he valued loyalty above competence and that his anger at perceived disloyalty could end careers and relationships. His reliance on advisors like the Duke of Buckingham and later Archbishop Laud reflected partly his need for supporters who wouldn't challenge his authority, as those who questioned his decisions risked facing his considerable anger. His execution in January 1649 followed a trial where Charles's stubborn refusal to recognize the court's authority demonstrated his temperament even facing death. His final years had shown a king whose anger and rigidity prevented the compromises that might have saved both his throne and his life, demonstrating how temperament can shape historical outcomes in the most dramatic ways possible. Number 18. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin. Queen's commanding will. Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, is remembered as one of England's most influential monarchs, though her temperament was a blend of strategic patience and stern resolve that could chill even seasoned courtiers. Born in 1533, she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and came of age in a court rife with intrigue. Her early experiences, including watching her mother's execution and later surviving imprisonment under her half-sister Mary I, shaped a ruler who combined caution with a fierce dedication to maintaining authority. Elizabeth's personal temperament was closely tied to her political style. Contemporary observers and later chroniclers note that she could be short-tempered and aloof, especially when her prerogatives were questioned. She was skilled at maneuvering court factions, and her favour could shift quickly. A nobleman might be lavished with honours one moment and then face the Queen's displeasure if he showed unwelcome independence. Her anger was particularly aroused by challenges to her authority or attempts to define her prerogative, and when council or parliamentary nudges threatened her control, the atmosphere around her could rapidly chill. Elizabeth's behaviour toward courtiers and advisers also reflected her temperament. She depended on trusted ministers, such as William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, but was known to respond sharply to those she felt had misunderstood her intentions or acted without her direction. Contemporary letters suggest that Elizabeth sometimes used sharp language and could be punishing in her critiques, especially toward those she believed were disloyal or insufficiently deferential. Biographical accounts describe moments where her facade of regal composure gave way to visible frustration when confronted with unwelcome news or political setbacks. At the same time, Elizabeth cultivated an image of measured command, using her temper not recklessly, but as a tool to reinforce her supreme authority. She was careful with her public demeanour, rarely allowing open displays of anger before the broader court or parliament. Her long reign, often celebrated as the Elizabethan age, blended diplomacy, cultural flourishing, and strategic restraint, all underscored by a monarch who could combine stern resolve with political savvy to maintain stability in a fractious era. Number 19. King James I, the scholarly king's contentious reign. King James I, who ruled England from 1603 until his death in 1625, and Scotland as James VI from 1567, brought a blend of intellectual ambition and regal confidence to the English throne. But his temperament and governing style often placed him at odds with both Parliament and sections of his own court. Born in Scotland in 1566, James had been King of Scotland since infancy and was well educated, fluent in several languages, and deeply influenced by classical literature. James's temperament was shaped by his belief in royal absolutism, the idea that kings ruled by divine right and were answerable only to God. This belief frequently clashed with Parliament's growing insistence on financial oversight and legal privilege. Early in his English reign, James struggled to understand the distinct political culture of the English Parliament. His efforts to maintain control over fiscal and religious matters often led to friction and mutual misunderstanding. Members of Parliament chafed at his belief in unchallengeable royal authority, and his repeated dissolutions of Parliament reflected his stubborn adherence to absolute monarchical power. James's personal temperament could also be combative in private and political interactions. While broadly mild compared with some predecessors, he could become restless and reactive when interrogated or pressed on issues of prerogative. In one notable episode in 1621, James angrily tore critical declarations from the House of Commons Journal and dissolved that Parliament, illustrating how his sensitivity to challenge could translate into sudden confrontations with England's governing bodies. Beyond domestic politics, James's social conduct occasionally drew criticism. Some contemporaries found his manners and habits, including a relaxed sense of court etiquette and an unusual openness with visitors, odd or unbecoming of an English monarch used to Tudor decorum. His pursuit of handsome courtiers and his tolerance for close favourites, who sometimes gained undue influence, also contributed to court tensions. Despite these stresses, James was not universally viewed as irascible. Many saw him as learned and cultured, with a genuine commitment to peace and scholarship. His sponsorship of the King James Bible, one of the most enduring legacies of his reign, testifies to his intellectual priorities. But his personal disposition, marked by a belief in unchallengeable royal authority and occasional impatience with dissent, set the tone for a contentious era that would shape the early conflicts of the Stuart monarchy. Number 20. King Stephen, anxious king in the anarchy. King Stephen, who ruled England from 1135 to 1154, presided over one of the most turbulent periods in English medieval history, often called the Anarchy, a civil war sparked by contested succession and factional rivalries. Born into the Anglo-Norman nobility, Stephen was known by contemporaries as wealthy, well-mannered, and capable of firm action. Yet historians also note that his reign was marked by anxiety over his legitimacy and military pressures that shaped his temperament and leadership decisions. Stephen's claim to the throne was challenged almost immediately after his accession. When his uncle, King Henry I, died without an undisputed heir, his daughter Matilda being widely recognised but resisted by many barons, Stephen moved quickly to seize the crown. Chroniclers recorded that his decision, while effective in gaining power, set the stage for extended conflict as factions loyal to Matilda continually contested his rule. His temperament during this period was not defined by explosive rage, but rather by a kind of anxious determination to retain authority in the face of relentless opposition. Medieval sources portray Stephen as a king who could be generous and sociable. He maintained good relations with the church and was personally modest, often dining and laughing with his men and servants. But the constant strain of civil war and the challenge of balancing rival nobles required him to make swift and sometimes harsh decisions. His conflicts with Matilda's supporters and the nobility demanded firmness. In a realm where loyalty was volatile, Stephen's temperament had to adapt continually to shifting alliances and military threats. The incessant warfare that characterized Stephen's reign, with castles seized, barons switching allegiance, and regions torn by factional strife, also influenced his leadership style. His approach combined pragmatism with occasional severity, and while not widely described as hot-tempered in the dramatic sense, Stephen could resort to forceful measures when his authority was tested. Chroniclers of the age noted his willingness to act decisively when necessary, even if his decisions were driven by urgency and pressure rather than personal malice. Stephen's reign ultimately concluded with a negotiated settlement that recognized Matilda's son, Henry II, as his successor, bringing an end to decades of turmoil. Though his temperament was not infamous for violent outbursts like some monarchs, his experience as king reflects the emotional and strategic stresses of leadership in a fractured kingdom, a ruler whose decisions were shaped by the precarious balance between survival and authority. As we've journeyed through the lives of these 20 monarchs, we've seen that royal power often came hand in hand with intense personalities, from Henry VIII's unyielding temper to Queen Elizabeth I's measured yet commanding will, and even King Stephen's anxious determination in the face of civil war. Each ruler's temperament shaped not only their reign, but the course of history itself. Some channeled fury into political action. Others allowed personal insecurities to influence monumental decisions. And a few combined brilliance with sharp edges that left lasting impressions on those around them. These stories remind us that behind the crown and ceremony were human beings, capable of both remarkable leadership and deeply human flaws. As you drift into rest, consider how ambition, fear, loyalty, and resolve intertwined in the halls of power, shaping legacies that echo across centuries. Thank you for exploring these royal lives with us, and be sure to subscribe to continue uncovering the fascinating and often surprising histories hidden behind palace walls.